all right. I probably can talk loud enough to. But I'll wait till he gets back there to adjust the volume a bit. One of the things I wanted to do when I came here was, because this has always been confusing for me, and I remember I was at a meeting in the Southern Union when they were having a year-end meeting, and the then Southern Union treasurer, Randy Robertson, who's now the North American Division treasurer, got up and said, we need to start explaining to the church at large, the constituents, how the church does its business, how the church uses its tithe, what happens with the offerings when they come in. He says, we as an organization probably have made it a lot more complicated than we need to. But he says we need to we need to be transparent in how the funds are how they're used and what happens to them. So with that bug in there, I started thinking about this, and this presentation I've modified it to meet what our needs are. This presentation actually came out of the West Allegheny Regional Conference. They developed this because they had the same issue. Their members were asking, what happens to the money once we give it? Where does it go? What happens to it? And so they developed this, and I've just taken it now and adapted it to meet a little bit more of our needs. It's still in the process of being developed because there's multi-layers in this thing to get it to work right. But hopefully you'll enjoy it. Please, if you have questions, ask them while we go through it. One of the things that I went through, and one of the things I've asked is, use of tithe. How's it designed to be? Well, I went through, and in 1985, the General Conference actually voted in their executive committee a document that said on the use of tithe. And all it was a reaffirmation of something that the church had voted long before then. They were just updating some of the wording and the terminology in it. And so this presentation is pretty much based upon the use of tithe throughout the organization. And it starts, the lowest level in the organization, in the Adventist church, who can collect tithes and offerings is the conference. All the money comes in from a local church up to a conference. From there, everything else happens. But the conference is basically the start of the storehouse. The local churches are asked to contribute, to give the funds to the conference, and then that's when it all starts and how the money is distributed. So we'll start with, as I said, it's a little slow because it's a large, there's a lot of moving components. And I may get out here so I can see this because I don't actually. But basically, as you know, through the Bible times, that basically tithe is, another word for it is 10%. So 10% of everything that God already owns and that he gives to us, he asks us to give him back. That's all he asks. Now that doesn't mean there shouldn't be other offerings, but the 10% is what God asks us to return to him for the support of the work. And what do we mean by the work? For the support of the ministry of the church. That means, and you'll see all that as we go through this presentation. We used to use $1, but I figured $1 isn't worth much anymore today. So I moved it to $100, so it makes a little bit more sense. So for every $100 of tithe that a member gives, 54.66% stays here in Minnesota. The rest of it goes somewhere else. Because remember, when the church set up this process, tithe was to support not just the local conference, but worldwide. And in fact, for years, and it's still in many cases, the North American division is still the highest tithe-paying division in the world. And so the North American division right now still supports many of the ministries that go on around the world. But 54 points, so in other words, $54.66 of every $100 is what we keep here in Minnesota to run the work here in Minnesota. 45.34% goes upstream. Mid-American Union, North American Division, General Conference. So the World Church Ministry leaves 13.5% goes to the NAD and the General Conference. This is gradually coming down through time because more and more divisions now, the tithe is increased. So what they've done, this used to be at 15%, that the North American division used to go up. At the beginning of next year, it will be down to 13%. Because now so many of the other world divisions are able to support the world church and not just the North American division. 9% goes to the Mid-America Union to support the union. 11.4% goes to fund the NAD Defined Benefit Retirement Program. Basically what that means is anybody who worked for the church prior to January 1st of 2000 was in a defined benefit program. Now, as you know, with most defined benefit programs, and our church was no exception, most organizations did not fund them. And so what's happened is that most of the people retiring today, looking at Rudy and myself, are going to have years of service in the old defined benefit program. 20, 14, 15, whatever, it's going to be in that old program. So part of the retirement, because the church obviously wants to take care of their employees when they retire. But what ended up happening was the church did not fund the defined benefit program. So we have all these retired workers, and remember, the Adventist church as a whole has the longest lifestyle after retirement of any denomination. In fact, 3 years ago, I was listening to the retirement office, and the retirement office had 7 people who had drawn retirement longer than they had worked for the church. I think there are now currently somewhere between 6 and 7 people drawing retirement that are over 100 years old, work in the Adventist church. So 11.4% of every dollar you give, or 11 cents, basically goes to fund the retirement plan for anybody who worked for the church before 2000. 3% goes to support Union College, which is this union's higher education facility. Every other union does the same thing. So the Pacific Union supports Pacific Union College in La Sierra. The Southern Union supports Southern Adventist University. So every union basically pays this, every conference basically pays the same thing to support the colleges that are within their union. 0.44% goes to small conference assistance. We have some conferences. One of them is Oklahoma. One of them is Dakota Conference. They have under 6,000 members. If the rest of the church, the larger conferences, did not go to support some of these smaller conferences, they would not be able to afford to have pastors to minister to the people in those states. And so the church set up a program where the larger conferences that have more membership could use tithe to help support the smaller conferences in the division. It's out of sequence a bit because I've been adding things to this thing. There's one other one that I wanted to add in here. We started a new retirement program January 1st of 2000 called the Defined Contribution Program. The Adventist Church contributes 5% for every employee, whether they contribute anything or not. They put 5% into that. Now, they highly recommend that employees put at least 3%, and now they're recommending employees should be putting in 7%. But we as a conference fund 3%. So basically, out of our tithe, funding for all of our employees, ministers and stuff within the church, we pay an additional 8%. So actually in tithe, we take 19.4% to fund retirement for our workers within the Adventist church. So out of every $100, $54 stays here in the conference, $45 goes somewhere else to support the other components of the work. So here in Minnesota, I'm going to show you how we use that $54. Now, we also do get money back from, they call it tithe reversion, comes back to our conference from the NAD and the North American Division and the Union. You'll see that here later also. So, what amount of yearly tithe do you think a church needs to give to say that they would be able to have a full-time pastor in their church? $322,538 is the annual tithe that a local church would have to pay to the conference in order to have a full-time pastor. We only have 4 churches in the Minnesota Conference that meet this. Now, does that mean we pay our pastors $322,000? No. Of the 54.6% of the 322,000, $176,310, is that what we pay our pastor salaries? No. No, they don't. Absolutely not. So what then is the 54.66% used, or the $54.66? This is how we support, and this is what's supported in the Minnesota Conference with the $54.66. Employee salaries, pastors, part-time pastoral staff, church planners, Bible workers, administrators, department directors, treasury staff, office staff, and support staff, and education staff. The education staff in here it's limited to 30% of their salaries that we can use tithe for. The rest of these are fully supported by using 100% of tithe to pay the salaries of these individuals. Employee benefits, medical insurance, auto, education, all these benefits are also paid for by the tithe that you pay into the organization. Just so you know, 85% of the tithe that you pay, or 85 cents of every dollar that you pay, goes to pay salaries and wages and benefits for our workers in the state of Minnesota. So the state of Minnesota balances the rest of their budget on 15%. When we move a pastor from another place and they own a house there and haven't sold it yet and they have to move here and find a place to live, we will pay them to assist with that for up to 6 months. Which is one of the reasons that the church quit moving people around as much as they do. Which is why pastors have a tendency to stay a lot longer now than they used to. I remember when I was growing up in the church, camp meeting time was the time when pastors used to get transitioned. And I remember in North Dakota Conference, we'd go to camp meeting, and we would know in camp meeting who was going to be our new pastor, because they'd announce it. The last Sabbath of camp meeting was always the announcement of who was going to be the pastor and who was getting moved for the districts. And then these conference offers, camp meeting, North Star Camp, evangelism. So the $54.66 is used to cover all these expenses within the conference. And when 85% of it is used to cover the costs of our workers, which is direct ministry related, and that includes evangelism, it doesn't give us a lot of extra money to support other things in the conference, like the subsidy we give to our academy, Maplewood Academy, the subsidies we give to other organizations and appropriations. So, besides the 54% that we keep, we send the money up 45%. 4.5% comes back down directly to the Minnesota Conference. But it comes with strings attached. We can't use it for anything other than what they've told us to use it for, because it's tithe dollars coming back down to us, and so they've been very strict about how we use this money. 1.8% gets directly attributed to go up for us to be able to go out and do church plants, to establish a new church somewhere. General evangelism. You as a church and through your pastor will request evangelism funds through the conference to help you run an evangelistic meeting here in the Duluth area or in this district. Each church is given an allocation. Now, you don't get what you ask for because we don't have that much money. So what we do at the conference is that we say, all right, if you ask for $10,000, we give you 50% of that, or we give you $5,000 of what you asked for. Because we just don't have enough evangelistic money to fund every evangelistic series that is done. Because we have 100 congregations here in the Minnesota Conference right now that we fund. Church building. That money is there for, say, a new church comes in and they want to buy a building. There's a formula that we use to give so much money to that church if they build or buy a building to establish a church. And this money is set aside in a reserve account for churches when they do that. Now, we haven't had a lot of churches lately buy new church buildings or build. Unallocated tithe is money that it's tithe money, but we can use it how we see fit here, but it has to be used tithe related. So in other words, it has to be used for one of the funds that I had up there before. We can't take it and go out and buy a car or a van. It's got to be used for strictly what tithe was related for, salaries and wages, that type of thing. North Star Camp, to fund the operations at North Star Camp, allows us to help kids who come there who need additional help. It just is funding for North Star Camp. Unallocated non-tithe, that is the only, of this $466,000 that comes back, $10,000 of it is non-tithe. In other words, it can be used for something other than tithe. So it could be used to help a church for example, or or fund some capital project. Like North Star Camp, for example, buy a new boat. For example, that money could be used for that. Yeah, it could be used towards that, yes.
So that would potentially be a loan to the church, right?
Yes. You would eventually have to pay that back, yes. No. The reason being is that the way the loan program works within the church, it's called the revolving fund. And the conference doesn't actually hold the money. The money is actually held at the Mid-America Union. And so what happens is the loan actually is processed through the Mid-America Union. The conference guarantees every loan. So if a church defaults on a loan, the MAUC comes after us, which happened 2 years ago. We had a church in the metro area called the Acts Church, had bought a church and got in over their heads, couldn't afford their mortgage. We ended up having to bail them out to the tune of $546,000. Now, we didn't have, it just so happened. No, because I can't use tithe dollars. Okay. The only way we could bail them out is we had a trustor who happened to pass away that year that left the conference $1 million of non-tithe money. So half of that, which we had plans for other things, half of that went to bail us out of a loan that should have never been written.
And we have changed our policies.
That is right. That cannot happen again. And all loans are approved by the Board of Trustees. Luckily, I wasn't around when this loan was approved in the first place. So we have going to Maplewood Academy. That is for projects at Maplewood Help. It could be Worthy Student. It could be anything at Maplewood Academy. Elementary education. $184,000 goes towards supporting elementary education. In other words, an appropriation that we give out to fund our church schools here in the state. The school up here in Duluth would be, part of that money would go to help fund the school here in Duluth. There's 11 elementary schools in Minnesota right now. The issue is that it's getting harder and harder to find teachers. Right now we have 5 openings in this conference for teachers because we have some people retiring. We won't mention who. More than one. We have 2 or 3 of our teachers retiring this year. We have not gotten one applicant for any of our openings. Right now, there are somewhere between 1 and 5,000 potential teacher openings coming available, and we don't even have 200 applicants. We don't even have 200 people to apply for them. North American Division. In the next 5 years, there will be 5,000 pastor openings in this division. Last year, Union College graduated 3 theology majors. No, we hire direct from the colleges. What we do is we will hire direct from like Union College. We'll bring them in here for a couple of years, and then we'll sponsor them to Andrews to get their master's, with the thought that they'll come back to Minnesota. But there is no strings attached that they have to come back to Minnesota. That's part of the church policy, which I don't quite understand either, but it's yes. So what's happening now is because that was happening, a lot of Andrews created what's called the MAPMIN program, and it allows them to get their Masters of Divinity online, so that people don't actually have to go. They can do it while they stay here and fully pastor in their churches. And we have 3 pastors right now in this conference that are working on their MAPMIN program. Academy operations, the money here, because part of tithe can be used to fund an academy, that money goes directly to the academy to help fund their operations. And then the church set aside, in our state, 1. Now, there are not many academies left across the U.S. They're getting less and less all the time. As you know, in this division alone, we've closed quite a few, because right now there used to be in Iowa, Missouri, now there's 1. There used to be 1 in each. There used to be an academy in every state here in the Mid-America Union. Now there's one academy for the Iowa, Missouri Conference, 1 academy for the Kansas, Nebraska. I think Rocky Mountain still has 2. They have a boarding academy and a day academy. And then there's Dakota Adventist and Minnesota. It's interesting, in the Mid-America Union, Minnesota is the only single state conference. Every other conference is 2 states. So you can see that of the 45% we send up, we get $466,000 back. And we're glad it comes back, because literally we would not have the money to fund some of things if we had to do this ourselves. In Luke 15:10 it says, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of God angels over one sinner that repents. And the use of tithe. The tithe is to be held sacred for the work of the ministry and the Bible teaching, including conference administration. Tithe is not to be expended upon other lines of work, such as church or institutional debt paying or building operations. And the tithe was to be used for the advancement of God's work on earth. Rather than burning up the tithe as he did the sacrificial lambs, God chose to use it for the support of the ministry. It was specifically used for that purpose. And so what happens is the conference is the local storehouse. So your church, when it gives money, tithe. Now, I'm just talking about tithe right now, but there's a whole other thing of offerings. And I'm going to touch upon one of the offerings that is used strictly in Minnesota here, and it's called Minnesota Advance. That is money that you give to support the ministry here it's not tithe, but it's used to support the work here in Minnesota Conference. On top of that, there's other offerings you can give to too. There's Sabbath school. There are a lot of other offerings. If you look at a tithe envelope, there's a whole list of offerings on there. And a local church can put some things on there themselves too that they want money to go towards in their local church for people to give to. One of the things that's on there is called local church budget, which many churches, and I don't know if your church does or not, has what's called a local church budget, and out of that, everybody gives the local church budget, and then you fund everything else underneath that. A lot of churches do that. I don't know if Duluth does that or not, and how they run their church. Okay. So, your treasurer is the one here that basically worries day in and day out about, do we have enough money to fund our local church? I have the same problem, with a lot more dollars at the conference. In regards to this. Any questions on the use on tithe and how it's used and where it goes? Okay, the defined contribution plan goes into, it's like a 401k. It's a 403b because it's nonprofit. And so that money is put with a company called Empower. So the church got smart, and they hired a third-party company to run this for them, because the church decided they weren't able to run them themselves and keep the money where it was supposed to be kept. So now they have third-party companies that they use that are constrained by government regulations and stuff. That money has to be kept for the employees of the organization. Most companies that have a defined benefit program are in the same boat we're in. They didn't protect it. Social Security is basically a defined benefit program. Because what it does, you pay into it. We paid 7.65% to what we pay in now as an employee. The employer pays that portion in. But you're not allowed, but you don't know how much money you're going to get until you retire. And they tell you how much money you're going to get. That's what the defined benefit program is. Basically, based on the years of service and that type of thing, they're going to tell you how much you're going to get per month. With a defined contribution plan, it's up to you. Because that money is your money, set aside for your use. But you're right. Because we did not manage, or the church did not manage things very well when they set up this retirement plan. And it's interesting reading the history of the church's retirement plan. The church set up their retirement plan the same year Social Security and Medicare were set up. Up until then, nobody lived past the average age before those two were set up was less than the retirement date on those events. Because when Social Security was set up, it was set up for people to retire at, I think it was 60 at that time. The average lifespan was 56. So very few people ever drew Social Security. Same thing happened with the church. The church set the same process up. Very few people ever drew from the retirement plan. What happened is those who did, though, were told from the very beginning that when you retire, we will pay you the same amount of money as you were getting the last day you worked for us. That doesn't happen any longer, Rudy. Because of how obviously investing in all this type of thing and not taking care of it, now there's a formula that they work, and it's not even close to 100% of what people get when they retire. Because it's supposed to be connected with Social Security. But as most of us know, especially the older generation, we just hope that Social Security is going to be there for us, and we're not worrying about the younger generation. We just want them to keep paying so that we can retire. Yes?
I think it's about time that the hospital, I know the NAD and the GC
No. In fact, the giving in the North American division has gone up every year. What's happening now is that the amount that they're not giving to the NAD, they're letting us keep. So that's why I said we used to pay 15% to the North American division and the GC. Then it went to 14%. We got to keep that extra percent. This year it's 13.5%, so we get to keep that extra 0.5% of tithe to keep in our own work here. Next year it'll go down to 13%, so we'll get to keep that other 0.5%. So it's allowing us to keep a little bit extra money here in our local conference to support the work in the local conference. And there's a lot of feelings about that. In that issue, that when the North American division decided to make that change, there are some people very upset that the North American division should still contribute to the world church the same amount they were doing before. But their argument is that the North American division now, membership-wise, is one of the smaller memberships division of the divisions around the world, but we still pay more than 50% of the tithe. More than 50% of the tithe comes out of the North American division. Yes. Right. There are. You know, and it's all the conferences and stuff, we're looking at that, you know, that we asked, well, why can't the North American division, because they have reserves set aside of things, why can't they take some of their reserves and fund the retirement plan and allow us conferences who are struggling to keep some of that 11.4% back here in the conference? But they said, well, all of you had employees who drew on that retirement plan. All of you are responsible to take care of your employees. That's why we're still paying into that 11.4%, because of all the employees that have worked here in the Minnesota Conference are all going to be drawing against that retirement plan at some point in time. Some are drawing against it right now. You know, our church is a worldwide church, so you may spend 10 years in Minnesota and another 10 years in this state and another 10 years in this state. All those states together contribute to that person's retirement. One other thing that we have here in Minnesota is called Minnesota Advance. Those funds are specifically used to support ministries here in the Minnesota Conference. We don't keep anything of this at the conference. It all goes to other entities. So the same thing here. One of the things I got to do is speed this presentation up, but we'll get there. Again, there's no percentage linked to this because we don't ask you to give a percent. That offerings are totally up to you as individual members, how much you want to give. The 10%, from a biblical point of view, is what God asks us to return to Him as a tithe to Him. Offerings are free will choice. It's up to you to decide. I remember back in the 80s, the church came up with this thing called 10 plus 10, for those of us who remember back to the 80s. And it was basically to set up that if you give 10% tithe, you should also give 10% to other offerings to try and fund the other parts of the organization. That didn't go over very well, and it didn't last very long. Yes, for local church budgets. There are suggestions, but yeah, there are suggestions. Obviously, they look at it as an average, what it would cost for a local church to operate, and so they kind of look at it. But really, it's up to the local church to decide what offerings they need to run their local church. So again, $100. And that stays all here in the Minnesota Conference. 30.5% or $30.50 goes towards evangelism. The largest portion of our Minnesota Advance money goes towards evangelism. It actually, the first two, 58.6% or 59%, go to evangelism because schools are evangelistic tools. So this goes towards secondary school operation funding, so that's Maplewood Academy. That's the only secondary school we have in this conference. 18.5% goes to elementary schools. So of the $100, $46 goes toward funding education in this conference. 10.8% goes towards North Star Camp, another evangelistic tool for young people. 4.7 goes to communication and PR so that we can communicate and send out to you the information that you as churches need to be aware of that comes down from the GC, the North American Division, the Mid-American Union, and also for us as a union, things that we do here in this conference. So it allows us to communicate. 4.6% goes into this church building fund to help churches if they need money. And 2.3% goes to secondary school capital funding for a total of $100 or 100%. It isn't a loan. You can request out of that. It doesn't have to be a loan. That money is there to be requested. We've had it requested, and it wasn't given. And it wasn't a loan. It was given. We had a church that their heater broke down. The school last year, your heaters broke down. We gave the school here money so that to get their heaters taken care of, and it wasn't a loan. It was additional subsidy we sent to the school, and that would happen with churches too. You know, there's a request form that goes through. It's mainly designed for church building renovations, that type of things, but it hasn't, and that's one of the things I'm looking at as a treasurer of what do we do with this money? How do we use it? Because we do have some money sitting on our books. Because we have reserves that we establish. The money that is given to that, if it's not used this year, it goes into a reserve account and it sits there and it just keeps building. Yes, we have it invested.
I'm curious about the school subsidy. So figure out what percentage that's going to be offered to each of the schools, and the school has to then determine the
Right. What we do for the schools is we have a baseline that we set for all schools, and it's 12 students. We pay a base, which is a one-teacher school, and we say, we're going to pay this much. One teacher, they would get a certain amount. Now, the church, we want the church to be involved in it, so the church would have to give something towards it, but it wouldn't be the full amount. Well, I'll just throw out a number. I'm not, for a teacher who's got maxed out, with benefits and everything, you're looking at about $90,000 a year. That's just salaries and wages and all that type of stuff, and benefits and all that type of stuff. They'll be getting less. But then on top of that, you've got your other your other expenses of a school. Your heating and cooling. You got new textbooks to buy. There's a whole bunch of other things in a school other than just a teacher.
So playing devil's advocate, when the board gets together and says, it's not up to us, though. It's up to you. A teacher?
No. We will meet with your search committee up here through James Davis. He is the education superintendent. You have a search committee up here. He will bring names for you and interview, and you will interview the people that he gets to come up for this position. It's your choice. It's this school will recommend to James the one they want to hire, and then we'll put an offer letter out to that person. That's the hard part. I was just talking about it on Thursday at the office, and there's great concerns. I mean, it's early in February, but usually by this time, and we're not the only one in the same boat. We went online to the North American Division has a job opening place for teachers across the division. There's over 200 openings for teachers right now. And I think when you look at it, not all of them would like to come to Duluth, Minnesota. And it's not just, more and more, we're finding that people don't want to come north. They want to stay where it's warmer. Yeah.
Have we had someone from the conference go down and interview kids
Yes.
at Union?
Yes.
Okay, because my brother said, we're sending someone over here from Michigan down to Union this week.
We've been to Union already. We've been to Michigan also. We go everywhere. We actually interviewed all the teachers back in November. There weren't many graduating. That's the problem. If you look at this union, there's like 10 or 15 openings in this union. There weren't 10 graduates. So it's difficult. The church is going through a transition right now because the baby boomers, which were the backbone of this church, worker-wise, are all retiring. We're at the end of the baby boomer era. They're all retiring. And the church is going through a real difficult time in regards to that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, I'm certainly not against Maplewood Academy, but it looks like they've got several streams of income on different slides that you showed.
Right.
I mean, how dependent is that organization on non-tuition money? Is it like 50% of their operating costs are not paid by tuition? I mean, it seems like
It's probably
they're not able to sustain themselves on tuition at all.
I would say it's probably a pretty true statement right now. The way I look at it is Maplewood Academy is your school. It's the constituent school for Minnesota. It's not the conference school. We support it, and we give them an appropriation that we vote through budgetary reasons that the church has given to us. But at the end of the day, it's everybody sitting here in this church has to decide about Maplewood. Just like you have to decide about your local church school, I'm not going to make a decision for you about Maplewood. I may come to you and tell you financially there's some issues you need to deal with, but at the end of the day, Maplewood Academy is your academy. And you need to decide, is it of value to you yet as a constituent member of the Minnesota Conference for us to keep Maplewood Academy? Because our new president came, and I agree with him on this statement, because he was asked this when he went to one of our churches. Did you come to write the obituary for Maplewood Academy? And he said, no. He said, I came to make sure that it survived and was revitalized. So it's not my job at the conference to write an obituary. It's my job to figure out how we can make it work. Yes?
The school situation came up. Minnesota was supposed to go to Iowa, Missouri, Florida.
Right.
And we chose at the conference not to go do it on ourselves.
Right.
That's why we're the only
Right.
conference. And I think we got ourselves on the back. We made it work.
Yes.
And, but it's up to the constituents to do it. They decided to do it. That's what
Right. And we need to go back out to the constituents, truthfully, from the conference, and talk to our constituents and see where they're at in this. Because the school is your school, you know. Yeah, we as a conference run it. We as a conference manage it. But it's really each one sitting here is your school to decide on Maplewood Academy. And we need to get that message out there. How important is Maplewood Academy to the mission of Minnesota Conference? From my perspective, from a young person's position who does, especially that where there's no other Christian schools, and they want to go through high school and they want to go to a Christian academy, it's the only one we've got. Do you want to send them to the one in Missouri or the one in Kansas or Dakota Adventist? You know, you're sending them a long way from home. You know, the big argument right now is in regards to boarding academies is we don't want to send our kids away from home. We want to keep them at home. So they'll put them in a high school, or they put them in some other Christian school that's in the community. It's amazing when you start looking at that, and they're doing some tracking on that now, the number of those young people who do not stay in the church.
Is it different than the kids that go to academy?
What was that?
Is it different than the kids who go
Yes.
what's the percentage?
Most of the kids who go to academy, it's over 70% stay within the church. They build that relationship, they build that connection to other classmates. So, and the spiritual environment at Maplewood Academy is high this year. You know, we only have 63 students there, which is bare bones for this academy. You know, I helped build a budget based on 70, and I just looked at their financial statement on Thursday, and with 63 students, they're running in the black. So they're doing the job there that they need to do. We, as you know, that's why I'm trying to get the message out to our constituents that you need to decide what's happening with Maplewood Academy. And Maplewood Academy plans on getting out more to churches. That, you know, if you want them to come up, a choir or the bell choir or something, call and ask the choir, call and ask them. They'll come up here. They're more than happy to come up here and perform. They got a great bell choir, they have a great choir, and they're more than happy to travel to churches.
They're coming to our church, I go to the church. And they come to really get very booked up. And so I approached them at the very beginning of the school year, and I got February. So, you know, just be proactive if you want them. They are amazing. They came to sing for Daniel's funeral service here at the Edge, and they do a beautiful job. And they represent us as a church very good.
Qualified to ask them to call and ask an elder or somebody?
Yeah.
Is it committee?
Anybody, any elder, any leader in your church, you're a head elder or one of your elders can call and ask. Yeah. Doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be the pastor. It should be one of your leaders here in your church can call and ask. Just make sure, I would arrange it with your board. Don't surprise them. That all of a sudden they show up and nobody else knew about it. But they're happy to come out. The kids want to come out. The kids enjoy it. I know they enjoy it. And it gives you an opportunity to get to know them. And a lot of these students actually tell you their stories as part of the process. they talk about their spiritual journey. Yes, it is. Yep. The third component, basically, is your local church. We have tithe, which goes to the conference. That's the storehouse for tithe for all the churches in the Minnesota Conference. We take that storehouse, it pays our ministry level things here. Part of it goes up to the union, part of it goes up to the general conference, and then some comes back. We have another offering called Minnesota Advance that we have that is a local conference offering, not tithe, that goes to support the things you saw here. Besides other offerings, I know people give free will offerings all the time to support different components. I know people are giving money every month, every week, to support the operation of Maplewood Academy through the Worthy Student Fund. There is money that comes through. You know, part of the budget of Maplewood Academy, $300,000 a year come from the constituents of Maplewood Academy to help with Worthy Student money. So it's so there's a lot of constituents already invested in Maplewood Academy. And we want them to be invested in the conference, because at the end of the day, you are the Minnesota Conference. Every one of you sitting in these chairs is the Minnesota Conference. So local church budget. You know, I put one thing, you have a church budget. I didn't know what else you had here, so I know you have a church budget. You have other things you support. You have a church school that's supported, but I think it's part of your church budget. Is that correct? I was at a church in California, and it was a really small church. We had less than 100 members, and we had a elementary school that had grades 1 through 8. 65% of our church budget went to support that church school. And the members were happy to do it because they were that invested into that church school. You know, we need to think about the same thing. Those kids are the future leaders of our church. And we need to give them the opportunity to come up through our church. That's why it's so important. I feel that we need to have an academy. They are the future leaders, because from there they'll go to our colleges. Because the number of kids who do not go to our Adventist colleges, who have not gone through our educational system, is pretty high. Now, we're trying to get linked into them through, I know some of you here meet with students in local colleges here that are Adventist and bring them into your homes and things. That's great, because that's a connection back to your local church. And we need more of that in the communities where we have colleges, because there are Adventists in every college practically in Minnesota. And we're working with, through our youth department at the conference, we're trying to connect to public campus ministries is what it's called. And we have somebody who works with that to connect, to create clubs and stuff and tie them to local churches on campuses. And so we're working with that because we recognize that more and more of our young people are not going through our Adventist educational system. Some of it has to do with cost. Our Adventist education is not, is expensive compared to some things. And part of that goes back to early on in our church. We did not create endowments. We did not have a lot of people give money to us that we put aside to help run our churches and our church schools. And part of that was our philosophy at the time. Was not about that. But now we're kind of paying the consequences of that because we don't have a lot of money set aside from 50, 60, 70 years ago that was invested to support these schools at this point in time. But a local church is only as strong as the offerings you have to support the programs you want to do in your local church. At the end of the day, the conference is only as strong as your local church, because the local church is what supports the conference. And so it's from the ground up. It's the very base. This church was built upon the fact that the member is where it all starts. And it's from the member up that makes this church to be the way it is. And I was talking to a leader of one of the other churches here in the North American Division, or a friend who was talking to him. And he said, "You don't know how blessed you are as an Adventist church to have the structure in place that you have for the payment of your pastors and how you run your church schools and how you do things." He says, "We wish we had your program." The Pathfinder organization also is, we have so many fabulous things for our young people within our churches. And the local church, that's what it supports. It supports Pathfinders, adventurers. All of those things are part of that, of what a local church does. But it all relies upon each of you as members of what is your priority in your local church. We have to prioritize things at the conference because, again, we rely upon you to be able to fund the things that we think are priorities. That's why we go out with a budget every year to our Board of Trustees, which Rudy's going to hear about when he comes to the board meeting this week, which is going to be a real struggle, Rudy. Okay, I'll remember that. We'll sing happy birthday to you, Rudy. But, just a little bit on how the church has done over the past, basically going through COVID. Because COVID really impacted the church. Maybe not so much in the offerings, but it impacted it in the attendance. Actually, during COVID, in 2020, when COVID came out and everybody started shutting their churches down, the North American Division and the General Conference were greatly concerned. And they came out to all the unions and the conferences and said, we believe you should reduce your budgets by 20% because we think we're going to take a 20% tithe hit because of COVID. In the year 2020, the Minnesota Conference had a 3.2% growth. The North American Division had over a 2% growth. One of the conferences, I believe it was Texas, took that to heart, the 20% reduction. They laid all their pastors off and then rehired them back a month later. People were, I think that tested the faith of organizations. Tested the faith of our members. We rely upon you as members to keep this church running. Adventist online giving, more than 60% of our members now give through Adventist online giving across the North American Division. Here in Minnesota, it's pretty close to the same percentage. So it's changed the way people give, how they give to the church. It hasn't changed what they give, but it changed that. But I think it's also impacted it negatively that they don't feel they have to attend church now, because they can give their tithe any way they want. They can give it online. Because the church is really struggling to get attendance back. Majorly struggling.
In Minnesota, do you know this? I mean, how much attendance was lost in this conference?
Somewhere between 20 and 25% of our church membership does not attend church regularly anymore. They lost that. They may come occasionally once a month, but the rest of the time they say, why should I come? I can sit at home and watch Dwight Nelson, or I can watch this person on television. But the issue is, as I said in my sermon this morning, it's the fellowship. It's the coming together that make a church. It's that building that relationship is what keeps a church vibrant. Otherwise, let's face it. If we decided that we were going to fund everything through the network and show everything, live stream everything, we'd only have to hire one or two pastors. Literally. And some people are looking at that, but that's not the way our church was designed to be built. Our church was designed from the ground up to have you as individual members heavily involved in what happens in your local church. You are the witness in this community. This church is the light here in Duluth and the school. And I don't know how much the school is looked at from in Duluth area as a representative, but I know our school system is one of the best. And people are looking for places to send their kids today. But any questions? I've gone on and on. I don't want to keep you here, but any more questions about how the money is used within the church? I know you had some questions that you wanted to ask. Did I answer them all? It does. And that's why the way I built my sermon today, basically it's about a relationship with God. God asks, everything is God. God says, part of my relationship to support the work of the church. The greater work of the church, not your local church. That's to support the ministers and everything above it. The Adventist church is very different because most of the other churches in the world are what we call congregational model. In other words, the money stays in the local church. So you pay 10% of your time. Let's say you pay 10% of your income and it stays in the local church. That goes to pay the salary of the pastor, to do the upkeep of the church, and all this. You may not have to pay anything else. The big difference between that model and the Adventist churches is that full 10% goes to funding the pastors and the workers and the ministry of the church. Only. Any other offerings that come in, like church budget and stuff, that money goes to support the. And so, we probably haven't done as great of a job in the Adventist church when individuals were baptized in the Adventist church. That model for them, and helping them to understand it. Also, another model that impacts this is when we have immigrants come to this country, that they move in from, say, Africa or South America or something, where the church for years has sent tithe over there to support their local congregations, and they're used to getting money from our organization to support their churches. When they come here, that expectation in some of them is still the same. That the money they give will support my local church, and they don't. And so it's a matter of educating people. Tithe is God's. That's all He asked for. And when you think of it, that's not a lot of money. But you know the old philosophy, the 80-20 rule? In North America right now, about 24% of our members pay tithe faithfully. 24%. Less than 30% of our membership is paying tithe, and yet we can run this church. Just think if we had 50% or 100%, the storehouse would be overflowing, and the ministries that we could do would be immense. Yes? Yep.
He was talking to me one time, and he said, you know, Minnesota Advance is just really struggling. We just don't have enough, type of thing. And so the discussion went such that, well, maybe you should increase the amount, because it was 2%, decrease it to 3%.
Mm-hmm.
And so he went into that idea. The next year, it was amazing what that increase did to that account.
Right.
I don't remember the figures, but it seemed like it was over 100,000 before that. It was down.
Right. I've been going out now and I've been talking about Minnesota Advance to the churches I go into. Minnesota Advance was on a decline like this. The churches I've been into, the Minnesota Advance funds from those churches has more than doubled. Once people are aware of how the funds are used, they give. And they understand. And that's why I think transparency is so vital to our local churches, to understand how the funds are used within this state and within the world. But more important, so they understand that when you give your offerings, you can trust us. You can trust the church, Trust. I've heard a lot about that we don't trust how the money is used. Come and talk to us. We'll show. I have nothing to hide. I am pretty transparent because at the end of the day, I report to you as individual members. I don't report to somebody else. You're my boss. Constituency meeting proves it. If you don't like what I did, you can vote me out. For what I just did here, I'm going to put this up. One of the things I plan on doing is, because with the new office now, we've got an area in there that they made a studio of. It used to be the MRI room, because the office that we now have used to be a doctor's office. And there was an MRI room that they converted into a studio. And I want to take this and put it on and record it once And I've asked somebody to come out and record me at a church, because it's a lot better to record it in a church, because you hear the answers and stuff that are coming from the church that could be part of this recording. And then we would post that online. Because just showing this PowerPoint and putting it up online for some without an explanation would be, it could be difficult because people may not understand. You have a question?
Yeah, I really appreciate the breakdown. That's an excellent explanation. I have a question for you about, you said that the money is given at the local church, which we encourage. But sometimes the question arises, for whatever reason, someone chooses to give to the local conference church. Can you explain that difference?
Okay, there is a local conference church, and the reason there's a local conference church is when members transfer into a state. They haven't chosen a church yet. So they can move their membership to the state that they who move their membership to pay tithe in that state until they choose where they want their membership to be. The conference church was only designed to be a transitory church. It wasn't designed to be a permanent that members could stay members of. Also, there are situations where somebody may have a windfall. You know, somebody owns property and they sell it for, let's say, $1 million. And they want to give tithe on what their windfall is, and they don't want it to go through the local church, so they send it direct to the conference. Not that they have a problem. Maybe they may have a problem with giving it to the local church. I don't know. But they do that so that they can be anonymous. And so that happens also. But we encourage people who join the conference church to move their membership out as fast as they can. You know, I'm probably the exception. My membership is at the conference church because I don't have a home church, because I'm out doing this most of the time. I probably should join a local church, but I haven't found one yet. But because I like...
I'm an elder at the edge, but you know what happens when you're a member of a local church? You're supposed to be there. You're the elder to lead, but guess where I am? And so it does make it a little bit harder when you have to go around the conference, because you can't put your feet down in your own church, and weeks will go by and I'm never there. And people greet me as if I'm a grand member every time I go. So, you know, for people like Gayln, who is away so much, staying in that conference is a lot easier.
And a lot of times I'll direct my tithe to a local church.
Yeah.
Like, we direct our tithe. All my tithe goes to the edge where Lorena goes. You know, the issue is Dan Yonere, when he came in, his goal was that he planned on visiting 48 churches this year. That was his goal. He says, my job as a president is to get out and know the members. And he says, I want to be in every church. So basically, that meant he would have been in every church here in the first 2 years of his ministry here. You know, we at the conference, since then, you know, Eric McCool, the VP for admin, and myself have said, look, until we have a president, we need to take that on ourselves. You know, we can't just sit in our offices. We need to be out where the membership is, where the members are, and help the members to see what we as a conference do. You know, I don't consider myself a preacher. I'd rather do this, what I'm doing right now, than have to preach a sermon. This is a lot easier for me. But at the same time, God gives you the skill set to be able to give you a message that people would understand. But I hope when our new president comes in, he will have the same philosophy, because the only way to get to know your members is to go to church with them. And I appreciate coming here today, getting to know you. You know, as I said when I first came in the first 6 months, it was nice not being known. Well, after the constituency meeting, that kind of went out the window. And then after last year's camp meeting, it went even further out the window, because I had to run camp meeting. But I enjoy going out to local churches. It's the heartbeat of our organization. You are the heartbeat of our organization. You can ask us any question, and if I don't know the answer, I'll find out it for you. Yes?
So here's another question about pastors. So typically, in other organizations, there's one pastor, one church, right? In our
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain how that works within our conference? And
Went from 3 to 4
Right.
after the last pastor was evidently a pastor died, and then they redivvied that district and this district. Maybe they still replace pastors.
Some of it, that's a tough question. And I hate to, some has to be with the fact that it's financially driven, which is terrible when you think of ministry that has to be financially driven. But the truth of the matter is that when you only have so many dollars, you have to figure out a way you're going to spread it around the conference and yet have pastors. As a conference, I'd love to have a pastor in every church.
Some of them are so small.
And, they are. Some are very small. But, the issue is that what we did when we do that is when we redistrict. And I wasn't here when they did this the last time, so this is what I've been told. Is they looked at it and created districts based on population. And they tried to divide it, so there's 10 different districts here in Minnesota right now. Each of those districts was divided out by population. So there's similar population in every one of those districts. What happened then is that some of those districts ended up with 3 or 4 churches because of the population. And then we also look at the tithe. We look at the tithe that comes in from the church. How many churches does it support a tithe in a certain area? And so then we consolidate those, and that's how we come up with a pastor. So there's no tried and true formula. It's an administrative tool, and there's faults to it. There's things that we could do to probably make it better, and we're tweaking it constantly. But there's no definitive answer to that. We do the best we can with the resources we've got. And yes, there may be some churches that have one pastor or a pastor and a half. What we do is there's no church in Minnesota that has 2 full-time pastors. There are some churches that have 2 pastors working in them, but half of their workload is for the conference. Like they are children's ministries director for the conference, plus they're helping in the church. They are the public campus ministries or a young adult ministries leader for the church, for the conference as a whole. So that means they can go anywhere in the conference and do young adult ministry. They're also assisting in the local church. And so there is no church in Minnesota right now that has that the conference is paying 2 full-time pastors to be in that church only. They are all divided up differently. It's dwindling. What we're trying to do is, I'm looking at it, we look at counties and regions and stuff, and it's not just Minnesota. Across the North American division, rural America is dying. When I was in the Georgia-Cumberland Conference, southern Georgia used to be a vibrant part of the Adventist church. Now, they're worse than Minnesota when it comes to membership in their churches. They have churches that used to have 300 and 400 members that now have 20. And how does a 20-member church support a church that was set for 300?
The church was huge, and we walked in, there was less than 20 people. You get when I started speaking that day, we're kind of like,
So, and I think that's what we're having to, the church, North American Division as a whole is having to come to terms with what are we going to do with our churches. Because where are our churches growing? The big cities. Because that's where the young people are moving. Right?
So then we're looking at something, if everybody's moving to a big city and not understanding why she counseled in Mall.
Right.
So that's where the people are. You're gonna reach the people. But why are you going there in the first place then?
Jobs. A lot of jobs were lost in rural America. Because you look at rural America, what was rural America? Farming.
We were just reading that today. I mean, that's what Ellen was, she talked about. The Israelites were doing a very agricultural and family. There was a design to it all, and there was a reason for that design, and now we're
That design is gone. You know, I was raised on a small farm in North Dakota. We had 1,000 acres. That was small when I was growing up. Now, a farmer can't make it today if they don't have 5,000 acres. But it's the whole dynamic has changed, and so we're having to figure out a way as a church too, because let's face it, our church used to be a rural church. That's where most of our membership was. Here in Minnesota, most of our membership is still in the outer areas, not the metro. 67% of our membership is still outside of the metro. And about 74% of the tithe comes from outside the metro. About 67 to 70% of our membership is outside the metro. And about the same percentage of tithe is outside the metro. It hasn't been shared very well, but I'm somebody who doesn't, I don't mind sharing it. Because right. You know, and that's one of the things I think that we're trying to deal with is we want to revitalize our churches outside of the metro. That's part of our aim this year is what can we do to come in and help you as a church be revitalized? And that's part, you know, that was one of the things that with our former president, he was going to come out to local churches and sit down and say, what do we as a conference need to do to help you revitalize this church? And he was going to sit in every church and do that. Now we've got another new president coming in, and, you know, hopefully we can instill the same mission on him, because I still have the same mission, to revitalize. It's easier to revitalize a church than to plant a church, because you already have members here. And we want to see our churches revitalized. I mean, Duluth is a great, you know, you've got a college here. Duluth is a major metropolitan area in Minnesota. Yeah. You know, the other area, you know, so we're looking, so the conference is looking now at where are the key metropolitan areas in Minnesota that we can link into and try and grow the church. This is one area. The Grand Rapids area is another area because they've got colleges. So we're looking at areas now, what we can do and how we can do that. And not forsaking some of the smaller rural churches that are way out and don't have anything. I mean, one of our churches last year, the North Home Church, closed their doors. They voted to shut down. They had 3 members left in the church. And they voted to close their church. And we're in the process of now trying to sell the property, but that's even more difficult. You know, we have another church, International Falls, which is, they renovated their church. It's a nice little church. They have 2 members going to it faithfully. Now, they used to have about 30 because most of their membership came from Canada. During COVID, when the border was shut down, they couldn't cross the border to come here to International Falls. Now that the border's open, they're starting to come back. But still, we have a church that we have 2 members. We have churches like that across Minnesota. And how do we revitalize those churches? And the average age of the membership in the one in International Falls is 75. So,
I taught them for 9 years,
oh, did you? In their church school up there.
and that church was standing room only. We had 70, 80 people come every Saturday.
Yeah.
And it was packed, and the church school had plenty of kids. And then when we left, they had a vote whether or not to get a new teacher in or just let the church school go for a couple of years and use that money for evangelism. So they said, sure, we'll just let the church school, we won't hire a new teacher, we'll use that money for evangelism. And so they called me when they had that meeting, said, what do you think? I said, what do you think I think? Of course you need the church school. That's part of your mission. You've got to keep your church school.
Yeah.
Their evangelism budget went up. That church went to 30 members in about 4 years. Because people who are looking there to move to work at Boise or wherever the work had up there had kids. And they said, well, there's not a church school here. I'm going to go somewhere where there is. And so they were making decisions like that.
Yeah.
We'll do that when we want that for our children.
But, you know, I think people forget how evangelistic a church school is. Your church school here is an extremely evangelistic tool for your church.
Well, it is for the kids, because think about this. There's a positive correlation between children who go through our system all the way to the end and who become workers. What did you say? Two workers, just a couple of theology workers? Well, that kind of correlates with the fact that church schools are struggling to keep enough kids, their own Adventist kids in the school.
Yeah.
You know, there was one other thing I wanted to make a comment on, and that is, in our system, we don't, if you have 3,000 members and you're the pastor, your pay is not that much different, other than certain subsidies that you get for maybe mileage or those things, than somebody who's a pastor of Duluth and the other.
That's right.
So our system, whether you are Doug Baxter or whether you're Dwight Nelson, whoever you are, your pay is not in accordance to who you reach. It's in accordance to our
Right.
That's why our system is so strong. Is because these individuals are willing to say, you know what? God is taking care of me. He's taking care of my needs. This is all I need to keep going. You talk about some of these churches where they have that theology, whatever it is, where the more money you make, yeah. I mean, they've got pastors who are millionaires and have 6 houses and boats all over the place and a helicopter here and there. I mean, you're never going to see that in our church, because the system is to support the whole world.
Yeah, the North American division as a whole has a wage scale. No matter where you work in the North American division, this wage scale is your base pay package. And it's $5,230 a month. Now, in high cost of living areas, we put in a housing allowance in there, because there are certain areas that you couldn't live on $5,000 a month because of the fact of the cost of living. So the church does that. But the base pay that everybody is paid on is that $5,000 amount. No matter where you are. That's even like, if you want to know the percentages, for example, the GC president, the maximum he can make is 115% of that number. I kind of jokingly say that the Adventist church, in many ways, is communist in its way it does things, is because the difference from the top to the bottom is very small. Very compressed.
We didn't have the system we did, the churches like Bruce Lake or
Right.
Cranberry would never see
Would never see a pastor. Yep. Right. And we want to make sure that if we have a church, we want to make sure they see a pastor and they can have a pastor. And they may not see him as often as you see him here in Duluth, but they still see a pastor. Any other questions? I'm happy to answer more or let you go home. It's 3 o'clock. And you said this is going to be 40 minutes. It's now an hour and a half. Yeah. I only had church budget up there because I didn't know what other. I could put a list of church things on there. I mean, you've got church school. You've got, your church budget encompasses a lot. It encompasses your utilities. The snow, all your plowing of snow. It accompanies the maintenance and maintaining of the building. Church budget includes a lot, and if you're giving 60% to a church school, then you only have 40% left to cover everything else. But you can look at this another way, is that lets you know how much this church is bought into the fact that a church school is important to this church. Mm-hmm. Television ministries, yeah.
They're thinking when they write tithe in an envelope that they're actually giving to that particular ministry that week. So that's something I'm learning that. And then also too with the online giving, there's things that are tied into our church budget that are still listed on the online giving, so it's confusing. And I didn't even think about that. So it's something that I need to remove since it's already part of it.
Right. And that's what we allow local churches to do, because there are a lot of churches who do not use a local budget line. They put an expense line for everything they pay.
I don't know if they can do that though, because one person would give all this money to this one part.
Mm-hmm. That's what was happening.
Yeah, so, and I appreciate what Rudy has to say too. It's really hard to budget when you don't know how much you're actually going to be getting.
Right.
This is definitely stepping on faith and
Now you know what I do every year. In a lot bigger mode, because from the conference, I know what my tithe was last year. And by faith, I'm budgeting that it's going to be this much next year to cover the cost of all my employees here in this state. But I have to rely upon faith. And I have to rely upon you as individual members that you see the importance of the work here in the Minnesota Conference. Right. Now, there are a lot of churches that rent out. This is the first conference I've ever been in that we have so many churches that rent from Sunday churches. In the metro, we have 6 or 7 churches that are renting from Sunday churches because they can't afford to buy a church. I mean, we have a church that we refinanced this year, and we had to get it appraised, obviously, to find out what it was. And the church, with the land with the building on it, which is about 1.5 acres, with the church on it, appraised for $550,000. If I bulldoze the church down and sold the land, it appraised for $1.5 million. Churches have no value, but everybody wants top dollar for their land. And so that's where we come into the problem. So, while yes, it impacts, because when you rent to a Sunday church, it kind of eliminates some of the things you could do here on a Sunday, because you're renting out to a church, which impacts what you as a ministry can do as a church. But at the same time, it does help fund your church. You're welcome. As I said, I'm happy to come back and work with you. If you got more questions, feel free to call me. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm done. Lorena.
And sharing this with us. I'm a great believer in seeing you folks from down there up here. And this is a good starter.
Yep.
Because I think that has a tendency to draw us together as a group rather than, well, there's those people down there, I wonder what they're doing. So, thank you once again.
I'll send you our bill later on.
Pardon?
I said I'll